Thank you, Daphne. What an honor it is to finally be here. We've been talking about this conference for a long time, and an honor that I would be one of the keynote speakers. Throughout this conference, we're going to talk about a lot of different types of tunnels, whether it's invasion tunnels, talk about not knowing who you're going to follow, but I think every purpose of a tunnel was just covered. And I hope that we get to talk about a lot of those reasons of why people go to tunnels, the history of tunnels. It's nothing new. I asked Daphne if we were going to talk specifically about tunnel bombs because they concerned me a lot as an old Army guy and thinking about have I ever looked down. I've discovered tunnels on the battlefield, I've discovered bunkers, but to say that I consciously looked down and thought there was a threat from the underground, it was not. And so she said, well, that's great, how about you give a talk about that? I study modern urban warfare. I am not a historian, although I am well known for murdering history during my presentations, and hopefully I won't let that down. But you cannot study urban warfare without studying underground. It's not going to happen, and we'll talk about that later in the conference. But I wanted to talk specifically about underground tunnels. That is a tunnel dug for the sole purpose of getting underneath somebody, putting explosives under there, and blowing them up. It's pretty simple. It's ancient. Where'd the clicker go? I'd already messed this up. All right, so appearances in history, again, murdering history, following that great presentation we just had. If I can drill down, because context always matters, warfare does change. War doesn't change, warfare changes. The technologies, the tactics, the civil implications, the laws of warfare, it changes. So if I can drill down to the context of a very specific tactic of tunnel bombing, then I can kind of narrow down the talk of what we're talking about. So ancient uses of tunnel bombs, tunneling goes, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, many times, is as old as warfare itself. Tunneling up to castle walls is more of an ancient siege warfare tactic, which really leads to a lot of what's going on in urban warfare today. But, I mean, the word sapping, the sappers, which most militaries, engineers, the sappers, comes from this tactic of siege warfare, tunneling up to the castle wall, and trying to bring down a portion of it, and then you can follow that on with an attack. About the end of the 15th, early 16th century, we see black powder, so then you start to see the use of tunnel bombs, which is the sappers tunneling up to the edge of the castle wall or the fortification to the city and blowing it up and then following the attack. That's pretty common, many instances across time. But siege warfare goes away, really with the advent of artillery, the advent of black powder, to be able to punch a hole through a wall, your fortification, you just can't do it. The age of siege warfare went away. And with it, we saw a gap in the use of positional warfare. We saw a gap in the use of tunneling under somebody to blow them up. When you fast forward, I'm an American, so I'm going to talk American history, of course. The Civil War, and the last presentation discussed it. I always like to throw in startling factoids because it helps my argument as I murder history. But during the Civil War, it was a positional warfare. Trench warfare was a thing. And one of the biggest that most people will reference if they talk about tunnel bombs is the siege of Petersburg in 1864, the Battle of the Crater. So over 5 weeks, the Union soldiers dug tunnels underneath the Confederate soldiers. One of those being the one that created this crater, which is still there. I lived there once and was able to tour it. But for 5 weeks, dug a tunnel 20 feet underground and then put 8,000 pounds of explosive underneath them and exploded it. It was very successful in the operation of getting underneath the enemy and blowing them up, but it ended up being a very bad mistake because it blew such a big hole up that they couldn't get out from the hole, and all the soldiers did was surround the hole and shoot down on them. So it was a tactical disaster. But it was something that was happening, and it wasn't the only place that happened in the Civil War. It happened in other locations. After that Civil War, of ours, the American Civil War, there's a gap in the history of this practice in, let's say, as a tactic of the conflict that's happening at that time. I'm sure I could find it, but you find other uses of tunnel. But this practice of tunneling underneath somebody because of the investment and then getting enough explosives into the tunnel to blow them up. You fast forward to World War I, of course, now we're talking trench warfare, besieged forces, or a stalemate in the conflict, tunneling happens. But this practice of tunneling underneath the enemy and blowing them up became very popular in World War I. It was at the Battle of Somme, although that was a disaster for many, the actual land component of it, but it had an underground component to include tunneling underneath them and blowing them up. The 1917, though, outside of a Belgian village of Messines, they invested heavily in this practice and for 2 years, dug 22 tunnels underneath the German forces. And now Daphne's shaking her head because I'm just stealing her research. For 2 years, they invest in tunneling underneath the Germans. And then in June of 1917, they implemented their plan to blow up the Germans. 19 of the 22 tunnels explode. It's 1 million pounds of explosives was used in the operation. It was the biggest explosion man-made until the atomic bomb was dropped during World War II. When I study it, it still blows my mind. And they say it changed the geography of that location for the rest of the time, what it did. Everybody knows after World War I, though, and also it killed 10,000 German soldiers in that one attack. That's pretty mind-blowing to me. I mean, the Battle of Somme, the many other battles, but that one tactic of tunneling underneath somebody and putting explosives under them killed 10,000 people in a matter of minutes. Pretty scary. And that's why, again, this topic really concerns me as a former soldier. So if you fast forward, though, maneuver warfare, the invention of tanks, the invention of many other technologies, the development of warfare across time, it goes away in my mind. And I can find instances of it, but you don't see it as a significant component of warfare of the time. Kind of goes away, right? Again, me murdering history. So in recent times, I'm supposed to be able to click on the photo. I'll play a short video. You have to watch the ad first. That sounds not so important.
Construction is underway in Syria, but what these fighters are building will not be housing anything or anyone but bombs. New amateur view appears to show drilling inside a tunnel in the Idlib province. The purpose of the tunnel, this fighter says, is to target forces from Hezbollah, Iranian militia, and the government army. When the explosives were detonated, celebrations abound. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says the assault is part of the latest wave of attacks on some of the last government-controlled areas in Idlib. 4 years of civil war in the country have killed more than 250,000 people and have driven more than 10 million from.
So that was a tunnel bomb in Idlib. I'll steal from, again, Daphne's research in this topic significantly, but so in May of 2014 in the city of Aleppo, you started to see tunnel bombs a lot. One of them 300 feet underneath a Syrian army headquarters, which happened to be in a civilian hotel. They dug underneath them. It only took them 30 days by hand because they didn't want to get detected, to put in explosives, blow the hotel up, and killed 40 people in a single attack. Shortly thereafter, they dug an 850-foot tunnel underneath a Syrian army checkpoint, exploded it with 60 tons of explosives, and it only took them 60 days to dig underneath that army unit and never were caught, and killed 20-plus soldiers. And then, so we saw it in Syria a lot, but then in about 2015, we started seeing it in Iraq. So significantly, hopefully we talk about this, about the transfer of the capability, the transfer on the know-how to do this, and whether you could, and Daphne has shown how this migrated from Hezbollah and Israel and the conflict and made its way into the Syrian conflict, made its way into the Iraq conflict. They're really good about that, what I showed, the propaganda of showing that they're doing this attack, and it's kind of significant in their objectives to make it on the international stage. But you really can't find that many of them. From 2014 to 2015, there were 45 documented tunnel attacks in these 2 years. That's more than, depending on when the fighting season happens, June, July, and that's 2 to 3 tunnels a month that only take them 30 days to dig. And then they're able to bring in 60 tons, 30 tons of explosives and blow them up. I say that that's a significant change in the evolution of this tactic of underground tunnel bombs. They were all done all of them done in urban locations, which I'll talk about later, why it fascinates me as well. If you talk about what it takes, I did it again. I got it. So in considerations, again, 2 years of conflict, 45 tunnel bombs. It still blows my mind. So if I talk about considerations, and whether you're talking as the adversary or the attacker versus the defender, and we'll cover some of that, is risk. So the risk of doing this is very low for the attacker, but the payoff is very high, right? So it just takes a couple people dedicated, they invest the time. If they're successful, huge, if not strategic, implications. If you think about the bombing of the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut, most attacks of this manner before these 2 years, which we've seen an ancient style of warfare return, was attempting to attack defensive sites with ground, vehicle-borne IEDs and other types of IEDs. I mean, I was deployed to Iraq for twice, one in 2003 and one in 2008. This wasn't a thing, and it really scares me that if it would have been in the environment. Capabilities, what does it take to be able to do that? It used to take expertise, right? You had to have sappers, you brought in miners. This is one of the things we want to cover in this conference is possibly the barrier to entry into this tactic is now gone. Whether you can go on the dark web or you can share information about how easy it is to dig a tunnel, 30 days by hand, it still blows my mind. So you need manpower, you need people that can dig it, and then you need stealth is a kind of another, which side you're on, whoever's doing this, you need kind of stealth. You need to be able to do it without being caught. And I tried to find a picture, but I couldn't find it. As we talk about how do you basically stop this tactic, and hopefully we'll talk about that in all the different technologies, but one of them is just, hey, there's a lot of dirt around that location. So in Syria and Iraq, we saw these 2 years of heavy use. We saw that wasn't a component. I mean, they're a little bit smarter than that. And so as we started clearing these locations, you found houses full of dirt. I mean, to the rooftops of every room. And that's where they were taking the debris, because if you're going to dig a tunnel, you have to be able to get the dirt out in your stealthful use of this. So I'm literally, if you think about 300 feet, one building away from you, digging a tunnel underneath you, and you don't know that I'm doing it. To me, that's pretty impressive. And then you need explosives, and I think you could attack. And there's many ways to attack this tactic and kind of stop it, but you need a lot of explosives to be able to do this, and you need to get it in there stealthily. So tactics, right? So this is not a new tactic, as in the doing it. So the counter, how to stop it, there's plenty of tactics, and if you saw in all the eras of which tunnel bombing became very popular, the counters to tunnel bombing became very popular too. Number one being countermine. If I'm in a static location, I know there's a threat of underground mines, I'm going to start digging a mine out, outside of it to countermine somebody tunneling in. I can't find anywhere in modern history where that's a practice of countermining. Another one is human intelligence, signals intelligence, aerial intelligence, modern day intelligence techniques to to find out if somebody's digging underneath me. The jury's out on whether that's successful. As an old infantry soldier, I would just say, count productive patrolling, right? If I'm stationary for a certain location, I'm going to start patrolling outside of my immediate area. Does that mean now I'm going to start entering every building that's on the outside of me daily, frequently, to make sure that there's nobody inside there that's trying to tunnel underneath me? So technology usually is where we'll go, right? And we tried to get some more technologists in here to talk about what would that look like. Most technology, depending on, and we talked about it culturally, what type of military you are, whether you're more an expeditionary force, a homeland defense, those types, you'll start investing in different technologies. So from our military, you see a lot of technology invested in identifying tunnels before you get there, being able to go down into tunnels and using technology so you don't have to send soldiers down there. About this, a tunnel bomb, what type of technologies would you need to stop it? Then you start going back to the old days of acoustics. I need to be able to hear if somebody is tunneling underneath me. Now that goes back to the very first tunnels in Roman times of countermining and then sticking people down there to listen to see if anybody is tunneling down there, or you hear something like that doesn't sound right, and then you start investigating. How you would develop, if you have acoustic type sensors or seismic type sensors with you, is number one question for me as an old infantry guy. Like, that's great, that's out. Do I have it with me? But in an urban environment that's full of noise, is that signal interference going to interfere with those tactics? Then you have LiDAR, ways to search the ground and all that. But for me, it's again in the context of somebody is underneath me right now digging. Would I know? Of course, if you're entering an operating environment, do you predict that this is a significant threat? Going back to risk. Risk to them, low risk, high payoff. Whether you're in an embassy, whether you're wherever, if somebody can get underneath you and blow it up, that'd be a very strategic implications for them. So the risk to you, the person in that place, do I believe this is a high risk to my operations? Is it a significant part of warfare today? That changes in the mindset of the military and who they view as their biggest threat. Would this be a practice against a near-peer adversary if there's another big war between two state actors? Would this practice start coming back up? I'll talk about that in underground warfare in another talk, but I don't know. Clearly, this was a non-state. With the examples, the 45 examples, mostly non-state actors attacking state actors using tunnel bombs. 2 to 3 a month for 2 years. That still blows my mind, and that leads me towards the end about surprise. I want to play a short video, and then hopefully it's not too loud. So that was outside of my combat outposts in Iraq 2008, outside of Baghdad. That was an improvised rocket-assisted munition. So it was a truck bomb that pulls up outside of your fortification walls and then lobs bombs inside of your location. Each one of those explosions was 200 pounds of explosives. 9 of them landed inside of our COP and destroyed every one of the facilities, but didn't hit a single soldier. But I lost 8 soldiers the next day from shell shock, basically saying that they could no longer take it because of that attack. It surprised us. We had been in Iraq. I had been there in 2003. It came back in 2008. We'd already been there 5 or 6 years. IEDs weren't a surprise. IEDs started on day 10. They started populating. They evolved high threat. This practice, highly specialized tactic, but there's almost no way to combat it other than cutting off all civilian traffic outside of where you are, because they were hidden in trucks. This one was covered, the entire truck was covered in soda cans. And there's no way for the defenses of that installation to see what it was. It was a surprise to us. It was a surprise when they showed up on the battlefield, and it was near impossible to stop. Next, fast forward to 2015, 2016, fight against ISIS. Hobby drones became a surprise for some reason. So the ability to take a commercial off-the-shelf drone, attach an explosive to it, fly it over somebody and drop it. A military capability, non-state actor, for some reason it surprised everybody on the battlefield. Because since the, again, I slaughter history. Since the Korean War for the U.S. military, we never had to look up. We never had to look up as a threat. My fear, and what I hope to get some out of this, I've never had to look down. I don't want this to be a surprise for any military tomorrow. But we better start looking down, because it takes 30 days. So you can say, yeah, I'm a U.S. military, highly offensive. The next war, I will be mobile. I will not stay in one location for longer than 2 weeks. That's just not a reality. So if I'm in a location for more than 30 days, I could have 60 tons of explosives underneath me. And the impact that would have strategically, tactically, it's really going to suck. Strategically, it could mean a change in the policy of troop involvement in whatever conflict that is. It could change everything. So I don't want the next surprise to be the fact that we're not looking down. With that, I'd like to transition to questions, hopefully not about history.
How do you motivate soldiers who are morally affected by the prospect of tunnels being dug underneath?
Yeah, so soldiers want to be, so that I write about this a lot in the different conflicts. It applies to all conflicts. Soldiers want to be able to know it's a fair fight. So they want to know psychologically things they are doing are going to have an impact on what's happening. So if, like this, what I would recommend for the future, and I didn't talk about tactics, so countermining is a tactic. So what would be the tactic that somebody would now use, no matter what, especially in the urban area, to know that there's a possibility that soldiers need to know that they can do something to combat that, and that they're not just sitting ducks. Whether it was driving down the roads of IEDs and then having tactics to prevent that, or technologies that help with that. They can't feel like they're sitting ducks, so they have to know that there's tactics they can do, like those patrolling, like the looking out for giant mounds of dirt while they're on patrol. They have to cognitively be given something that they know they can, because like the IRAMs, once that happened, it took a lot to get them psychologically back in the mind that they could do anything to stop the next one. I think that we could develop tactics, and we should develop tactics. If this is going to be, that's what, I think the number one challenge to subterranean warfare in general is convincing leadership that it is important and worthy of valuable training time, that it will be a component of the next war. Just for the U.S. military, and I don't speak for anybody but myself as well, it's really hard to convince them that this will be a part of your next war. Where you need to start implementing on every type of training event that when you stop for more than a couple days, you need to consider the fact that 2 buildings over, somebody could be digging a tunnel to try to attack them. That answer your question, sir?
Absolutely, thank you.
Samir from the IDF Ground Force. As a former soldier, and as you said, that you never had to look down, what scares you more? These types of tunnel bombs that are dug actively to your current location, or the types of defensive facilities that are underground and makes you fight the sunfight over and over again as you come into new ground?
So you're talking, good question. I have been I was trained. I'm not a soldier. I was trained when fighting offensive operations. So, like if somebody's got a bunch of underground facilities within an urban area, and I know that that's something that I'm going to have to enter, that doesn't scare me half as much as somebody getting into my psychological loop of the place where I think I'm safe. When I'm forward deployed, when I'm in a battle zone, I know that to never let my guard down, never think that I'm safe. If I have established some type of defensive position, there is a point in kind of a human need to have a point where I feel like I'm safe. It scares me that if this tactic becomes so pervasive, no matter where you go, you're going to get that you're not safe, and you could be surprised. I don't think it'll happen more than a few times, but what scares me is that those first few times, and then I think you'll develop where you don't feel you're safe, but that's going to have psychological impacts, just like it did in World War I, when you can never find safety from bombing, from shelling. So definitely, the underground bombs scare me more than attacking into a combat zone and knowing that there's an underground structure that I have to clear.
Thank you for your lecture. You didn't distinguish between a situation that the war is with a neighboring state and the preparation can be totally different, vis-a-vis a situation where the war is actually in a foreign place. Right? You are from the U.S. Army, but you are now fighting in Iraq, so you can obviously prepare your own force, but you cannot prepare probably the ground beforehand. But when it's your own country and you're thinking about a fight with a neighboring state, then you can start preparing the conditions on the ground.
Yep.
So
Yeah,
I want to hear more about that,
Yeah,
the distinction between the two scenarios.
Yeah, I think it's huge. We talked about the cultural mindset of whatever the armed forces are. If I'm an expeditionary military and I know I'm going to be fighting on foreign land, it's a lot different than I'm here having to, or I'm at my state trying to protect from this tactic. I don't say neither one of them are easy, but if this became pervasive and without surprise, you could have a defensive plan that's more in depth with this challenge, whether it's ground sensors, all that. To me, it replicates for us. If we go to, especially it's not your ground, you're in a foreign land, you're stopping. We have all types of technologies that we've learned to put up. Signals intelligence, cyber, your own radio communication, and then we started putting up radars for incoming rounds. And almost everybody had them. It's kind of part of the war today is that you need to be able to intercept or know about things that are coming in at you. And now we've moved that to drones. It isn't a practice of multiple militaries to think about this or to have stuff with them readily available that if I know that I'm on the move and when I stop, this is a threat. But in most countries, as a part of force protection, they will have area defensive technologies that many of them do consider seismic disruption and are looking down. But into a conflict, whether it's a internationally recognized armed conflict or just a non-internationally recognized conflict, the distinction to me is your thought process and how you're going to implement the war or the fight. And when you're stationary, and you're always stationary, whether you're in your own state or you're a forward position unit that's been there for years, there's a big difference on the technologies or capabilities or training or individuals you'll have with you to prepare for that. Does that get close? Yeah.
Okay, we're out of time, but thank you very, very much for this.